So a few weeks ago, Mr. Wilson asked me if I would teach on Colossians chapter 3. So if you go ahead and turn there. And he particularly wanted me to focus on verses 12 through 16. Colossians 3, 12 through 16. So we'll read that, and then we'll get going here. Colossians 3, starting in verse 12. So, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with one another and forgiving each other. Whoever has a complaint against anyone, just as the Lord forgave you, so also should you. Beyond all these things, put on love, which is the perfect bond of unity. Let the peace of Christ rule in your hearts, to which indeed you were called in one body, and be thankful. Let the word of Christ richly dwell within you, with all wisdom, teaching and admonishing one another with psalms and hymns and spiritual songs, singing with thankfulness in your hearts to God. So, just a couple of things here before we get going. Though we understand the working of God, God is always working. God is the one who is making everything happen within His plan. Though we understand that, we understand as well that we, in all of these parts that God is working, we have our part that we have to play as well. Just a couple of thoughts here. Even in salvation, turn back a page there in Colossians chapter 2. And by the way, Colossians chapter 2 helped me when I was sorting through my own struggles with the meaning of immersion. I was raised in the Baptist church, and as I was reading the scriptures through myself, as I was encouraged by all my family and all the leadership within the Baptist church, I was encouraged to do that. I was hitting all these baptism verses, and I was, like Mary, I was quietly pondering these things within my heart, because, this is just something that was really hard to discuss with people who may have been a little bit hostile towards any type of, we'll just say, alternate thinking, we'll say that, or maybe even thinking, period. But it's interesting. I struggled, even with all these other verses, I would find answers for them, but I was struggling with a few things. Colossians chapter 2 is really what helped push me over the edge in understanding why immersion was not a work that we did that could not be counted as the Ephesians 2, not of works lest any man should boast. It really helped me. So I'm just going to pick up there in verse 12. It says, having been buried with Him in baptism, in which you also were raised up with Him through faith in the working of God who raised Him from the dead. Boy, that hit me when I first read it, because it is God who's working. It's God who's doing an operation. It is the power of God that's working. So even though God is working in our salvation, we still have to choose. We still have to obey. And so we understand God is working even in our salvation. But also, and this is where we're getting with our text today, with our growth and even our final destination, God is working. Now, we've been in Philippians, the book of Philippians on Sunday night for quite a while, and we're all familiar with chapter 2 and verse 13. For it is who is working within us? What does it say there? For it is God who is at work within us, both to will and to work for His good pleasure. So we understand God is working. And even as we are, our character is being transformed and we're growing, we'll go ahead and turn to that passage we all know, 2 Corinthians chapter 3. We understand this very well. Let's just start in verse 17. It says, now the Lord is Spirit, and where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. But we all, with unveiled face, beholding as in a mirror the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into that same image from glory to glory, just as from the Lord the Spirit. So the Lord is working, the Lord is transforming. He's doing all these things, not just to save us, but to perfect us, to get us to the glory. He's doing that work. But even in the midst of that, even with what He's done for us and what He has made us, we still have to, even now, make choices. And you understand that. We still have to be involved in this. Couple of verses, there are a plethora of verses, but a couple of verses. Well, Hebrews 4:11 talks about, I'll just tell you, because there's no way I'm going to have time to go through all the concepts in this passage. But Hebrews chapter 4 and verse 11 tells us to be diligent so that we do not fall short of what the Lord has had planned for us. So we have to be diligent workers. And we know what 1 Corinthians 9 there at the end says. It says that, he says that I buffet my body, I beat my body, I discipline my body and make it my slave, lest after I preach to others, I myself would be disqualified. We have to put the effort in this. And maybe even more specific, some words that are maybe tough for us to hear as we're thinking about what the Lord has done. Again, this is just a sampling of verses. Turn to 2 Corinthians 7. 2 Corinthians 7, and we'll just read verse 1 there. Therefore, having these promises, of course, the ones that are mentioned before that, these promises, beloved, let us cleanse ourselves from all defilement of flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. You know, we don't think about that too much, about cleansing ourselves, but the Bible says that, only indicating that we are playing a part in this whole process of growth. We are playing a part in this journey to glory. And then, of course, we mentioned Philippians 2:13. You have to mention Philippians 2:12. Not just that God is working within us, but we are working. You know, we are working out our salvation with what? Fear and trembling. So the Lord does the heavy lifting for sure. But the Lord is working with us. We are holding His hand in this process as we are working together to make it to glory. And that's what this Colossians passage, go ahead and turn back there, Colossians chapter 3, is going to help us to understand. Even within Christ, we have to choose to do the right thing. And before we even talk about doing the right thing, doing the good, marching forward and doing the work of the Lord, it's going to help us to have a little bit of context here. Most of us are familiar with the wonderful good promises and the good admonitions of the first part of Colossians chapter 3. We know verse 1 there. Therefore, if you've been raised up with Christ, and guess what? You have been raised up with Christ. You know, keep seeking things above where Christ is, seated at the right hand of God. Set your mind on things above, not on the things of the earth, for you have died, and your life is hidden with Christ in God. Doesn't that just give you such confidence to read that, such hope, such direction? And then verse 4 has always been one of my favorites. When Christ, who is our life, is revealed, then you will also be revealed with Him in glory. So many good things there. But in the midst of all this, before we're going to talk about the things that the Lord asks us to put on, the Lord talks about putting some things off. You really have to do that. Now, we don't like to focus on that because we'll say things like, we don't want to talk about the things we need to stop because then we're thinking about the things that we need to stop. And I get that that's not where we need to land. But the Bible does talk about putting away certain things. So we can't ignore that. And so before we can talk about putting some things on, just look there at verse 8. It says, but now you also, putting them all aside, anger, wrath, malice, slander, and abusive speech from your mouth. Do not lie to one another, since you laid aside the old self and its evil practices. You know, even after we become Christians, we have to continue putting aside, as I think James would say, the evil that remains, or the wickedness that remains. We still have to be working with the Lord in purging this stuff. It kind of reminds us of a familiar passage there in Hebrews 12. Might as well look at that. Hebrews 12:1 there, you could probably quote it. Therefore, since we have so great a cloud of witnesses surrounding us, let us also, here we go, lay aside or put off or take off. Lay aside every encumbrance and the sin which so easily entangles us. We have to do that before we actually run the race. You know, before we successfully move forward, we got to also be focusing on not only laying aside the sins. We get that. The Bible says shoot and kill. Okay, we're going to stop that one. Okay, you know, we get that part. But it also says laying aside the encumbrances. Some versions there say the weights. Anything that holds us back and holds us down, even if it may not inherently be a sin in itself, if it slows us down and it personally is maybe one of our personal things that keeps us from doing the best we can for the Lord, the Bible says, the Lord tells us it's time to put those things aside. So again, we're always thinking about putting things aside so that we can move we have to move forward. So in the midst of all this, and we're putting these things aside, we pick up back there in Colossians 3, and I love this. In verse 10, it says, and have put on the new self, which is being renewed to a true knowledge according to the image of the one who created it. A renewal which there is no distinction between Greek and Jew, circumcised and uncircumcised, barbarian, Scythian, slave and freeman, but Christ is all and in all. So before we actually get to our text, does Colossians 3 verses 10 and 11, does it remind you of any other familiar passage that we often talk about in relation to salvation? I'll just say that. Just yell it out if it reminds you of one. Well, you'll think of this as soon as I put Galatians. Yeah, go ahead and turn to Galatians, because I want us to see this, because it's going to really help with my theme here and what I'm trying to emphasize. So, Galatians chapter 3. We'll just start verse 26. Galatians 3:26. For you are all sons of God through faith in Jesus Christ. For all of you who were baptized or immersed into Christ have clothed yourselves with Christ. Does anybody know what the King James Version there says in verse 27? For all of you who have been baptized or immersed into Christ have what? Did you say it? Yeah, put on Christ. There's the idea of putting on Christ. So even though, and then of course it goes on to talk about no distinction. So that's the parallel there. So it's interesting, even as the Lord is doing this work, even as the Lord is, it is the Lord who raises the person to newness of life. He's the one who does this. It is interesting that the verbiage here is that we clothe ourselves with Christ and we put on Christ. There still is that mindset of a decision being made. So with that in mind, I want to pick up, and I'm sorry I'm moving fast, because Mr. Wilson, I wish he'd give me 2 verses. He'd give me a bunch of verses. I'm going to try to hit, as much as I can of all these verses. So back to Colossians chapter 3. Putting on stuff. You see, look at what it says there in verse 12. So as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, put on a heart of compassion, kindness, humility, gentleness, and patience, bearing with another, and so forth. When we became Christians, the Lord actually gave us a new heart. We understand that. That's a prophesied thing. We've been given, it's described in a lot of different ways. Back in the Old Testament, in several places, it talks about having a new heart, giving us a new heart, one that is not hard like a stone, but one that's soft and malleable, that can be shaped and changed. So the Lord has given us a new heart. When you come out of the waters of immersion, you have a heart of compassion. You have a heart of forgiveness. You have the heart of the Lord. It's a new heart. It's also described as a circumcised heart. Which I love that, because it's obviously something that the Lord's hand can only do. He comes and back in Colossians 2, it is called a circumcision of the heart. Also in Romans chapter 2, where the Lord goes and he kind of pulls that body of sin away from that heart, so that we're no longer slaves to sin. It's exciting stuff that the Lord has done. So this is the Lord's work. There's no way I can give myself that new heart. But this is what I can do. Is it possible for me to still choose not to live that way, even when the Lord has given me that new heart? And I think this is what Paul is emphasizing here. I still have to put that heart on. And because the Lord, it's not just here where the Lord says these kinds of things, where the Lord tells us to basically put into practice, to put on, to clothe myself with that which the Lord has given me. It requires thought. And so maybe if I had to put a theme to this lesson, or maybe even a summary statement early on in this lesson, would simply be this. The new creation, or the renewed mind, still has to be chosen every moment of your life. We have to choose this every day. It's not just something about, I'm renewed, I'm transformed, so I'm just going to be doing the right thing all the time. We still have choice. And that's kind of what free will is, isn't it? We talk about, we have free will. Man has free will to choose. But when we get in Christ, we still have the choice to do the right thing. Now, our mindset is different though, right? we understand that there is a better choice, and there's a choice that we want to make. I don't have this in my notes, but let's go ahead and turn to 1 John. Sometimes it's a mindset. Now, if you remember, John was dealing with, I don't want to say the Gnostics because they hadn't quite developed yet, so we're going to call them the pre-Gnostics. That idea of Gnosticism had started at this point, and it was creeping into the church. The idea that, my body can sin, but my spirit cannot sin. And it's interesting, in the midst of this, he gives us actually, John, the Holy Spirit through John, really gives us the picture. It's not so much that we cannot sin as much as that ought to be our attitude. Our attitude is that. And so he counters it with the choice. He counters the false doctrine of, well, now that I'm a Christian, I can't sin, with the idea that that's going to be my attitude, so it'll help me to not sin. So look at 1 John chapter 3. Boy, I've been in a lot of chapter 3s today. I'm just noticing that. Let's start in verse 4. Everyone who practices sin practices lawlessness. And sin is lawlessness. You know that he appeared in order to take away sins, and in him there is no sin. No one who abides in him sins. No one who sins has seen him or knows him. Now it's interesting. At first glance, this might look a little bit like he's espousing the very false doctrine he's trying to fight against, Yeah, I'm in Christ. I don't sin, Just hang on to that just for a second. Verse 7, little children, make sure no one deceives you. The one who practices righteousness is righteous, just as he is righteous. The one who practices sin is of the devil, for the devil has sinned from the beginning. The Son of God appeared for this purpose, to destroy the works of the devil. No one who is born of God practices sins, because his seed abides within him, and he cannot sin because he is born of God. Now, what I want to suggest to you is the Apostle John here replaced that pre-Gnostic idea of the separation of the spirit and the body in responsibility of sin. Basically, they use that as an excuse to go sin. Well, I'm going to sin, but that's my body. It's not my spirit. So, man, I'm getting the best of both worlds. You could see how that would be attractive to those who are not attempting to walk according to the Spirit. But he offered a different thought here. He said, if you're born of God, your mindset actually should be that, so that your actions would change. I always talk about my grandma Sutton a lot, because she really struggled in accepting the reality of the nonsense of our family at times. She in her mind, she lived back in the good old days when the Suttons had a good reputation in the community. But later in her life, the Suttons did not have a good reputation anywhere, but she liked to live back in those times. And so she would often say to me, when she would see something crazy going on in town, or she would hear a story of something, she would turn to me and she would say, "Now, Philip," she said, I just need to let you know that don't ever shame your family. Don't ever spoil the Sutton name by doing that. You're a Sutton. You should be doing better than that. Of course, I knew even at age 12, I was like, you don't know the Suttons very well, do you, Grandma? But anyway, but that's kind of the hope she lived in. We understand this. We understand the idea of, that which is born of God does not sin, because God doesn't create sin. And so we need to view ourselves as someone who is not practicing sin. Like, for instance, if I'm faced with a question, if I'm faced with a right and wrong, I need to view myself as a person who's going to choose right. You see, this is a mindset that the apostle was getting there. And that kind of goes along with James. Surprise, surprise, the writers of the New Testament agree with one another. But, just turn a few pages back there. James chapter 4. We'll just hit the one verse. Therefore, to the one who knows the right thing to do and does not do it, to him it is a sin. The concept here is Christians are able to do and to choose the right things. And not just are they able, we can make the positive statement, that's what Christians do. Do you think that's fair? Even though experience has shown us that sometimes they choose the wrong thing. But isn't it a fair statement to say Christians do the right thing, and since I'm a Christian, I'm going to do the right thing? Do you think that is consistent with the Scriptures. And that's where John is getting this. And so applying that, so go ahead and turn back to Colossians 3. Paul is trying to help Christians to see these are things that Christians do, so we are going to do those things. So we've laid aside that stuff that holds us back. And by the way, before I even get any further in this, and already about out of time I feel like, but before we get any further in this, it's really important for us to be honest with ourselves about the things that we do need to lay aside. I mean, again, murder, adultery, those things, we got that part. That's pretty clear in the Scriptures. But the other encumbrances that hold us down, because if we are not aware of the things, or we make excuses for the things that hold us back, and maybe even say things like, well, there's nothing wrong with that, anybody would do this, it's not as bad as this or that. If we're not careful, we're going to look for reasons not to put on these things that we're talking about. We're going to look for exceptions to these rules that we're about to say, or these standards that the Lord has given us. We're going to see that maybe some of these things don't apply to us, or we'll change definitions, and you'll see what I mean here in just a second. So the first one, this is what we're going to put on. Of course, we've put on Christ. The Lord has created the new self. He has created the new man, but we have to put that on. In addition to that, we have to continue putting things on. So verse 12, so then, as those who have been chosen of God, holy and beloved, I'm going to start out by putting on, I'm going to combine this, put on a heart of compassion and kindness. I'm going to combine those two. Compassion, kindness. Is it always natural to be compassionate and kind? Is it? No, because compassion and kindness, as well as these other things we're going to talk about in a moment, but compassion and kindness, they're easy to put on the back burner of our consciousness because these things interrupt our day. Compassion and kindness will interrupt our schedule if we're not careful. Sometimes even to the point where we'll redefine and reapply so that we don't have to do these things. Now, if we're going to be talking about compassion and kindness, of course, who's going to be the best definition, the best example of any of this? The Lord. Okay. Now, it's interesting, and we'll look at just a few examples of these because there are so many of them. But the Bible uses words to describe Jesus like just simply he had compassion. Others places it would say he was moved with compassion. Interesting verbs there. So let's just look at a couple of them. Let's look at Matthew 20:34. Matthew 20:34. The context here, we'll start in verse 29. As they were leaving Jericho, a large crowd followed him, and two blind men sitting by the road, hearing that Jesus was passing by, cried out, "Lord, have mercy on us, Son of David." The crowd sternly told them to be quiet. And isn't it interesting how people often think that compassion is a burden and giving assistance is a burden, and it interrupts. Sometimes this is going to interrupt the big picture of the master. I mean, we know who he is. He's got bigger things to do. And sometimes we can adopt that mindset even about ourselves if we're not careful, just to nullify the concept of compassion. But they cried out all the more, "Lord, Son of David, have mercy on us." And Jesus stopped and called to them and said, "What do you want me to do for you?" And they said to him, "Lord, we want our eyes to be opened." Moved with compassion, Jesus touched their eyes, and immediately they regained their sight and followed him. Now, we're going to find out later that, but you already know, Jesus had an ultimate mission, didn't he? Did he come here? Was his goal to heal blind people? Was his goal to come to earth that? So it's interesting, though, he did notice that. And of course, this can't ultimately fulfill the ultimate goal, but he noticed and he recognized that. A couple of other ones, Luke 7. Luke 7. Where's the best place to start? Let's start in verse 11. Soon afterwards, he went to a city called Nain, and his disciples were going along with him, accompanied by a large crowd. Now, as he approached the gate of the city, a dead man was being carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and a sizable crowd from the city was with her. Now, it's interesting. Do you guys still pull over when a funeral procession comes by? In the South, that's big. A funeral procession comes by, you see the hearse, you see the people coming, you pull over to the side of the road and you wait for them to pass. Is that just a Southern thing, or do they do that here? Used to do it here, yeah. Yeah. But that, as a matter of fact, there was a time when some of the police escorts would point you and tell you, if you're not going to show respect, we're going to tell you to show respect. And of course, you probably could have fought that in court, but I would hate to go to court and say, they made me show respect. So you're usually just going to pull over and you're going to be quiet. You know what I'm saying? But it's just a big thing. So we understand that. We understand that it's maybe a good thing to at least notice the pain and the suffering of others. Though I do feel like, as you said, it used to happen, maybe it's not as normal and common to notice the pain and the suffering of others. Maybe that's kind of something that's going down within our society, decaying a little bit. But there it was. So they're going in. There was a dirge, a funeral procession. So let's pick up in verse 12. Now, as he approached the gate of the city, I've already done that. Verse 13. When the Lord saw her, so he saw the procession, he noticed the woman. I don't think that this was necessarily divine knowledge that he noticed her. How do you think he noticed her? She was probably crying. She was upset, probably the clothes that she was wearing. I mean, it was a procession. It was a lot of people. She caught his notice. When he noticed her, he felt compassion for her and said, "Do not weep." Well, first of all, I want you to understand here, compassion. Compassion, if it's true, and you are actually seeking to show it, it's going to cause you to do some things that are a little bit uncomfortable. Did he know this lady? All indications was he didn't know who this lady was. So he goes up to this lady, it just says, "Don't weep. Stop crying." I remember one time when one of my relatives died and my aunt was just crying, just weeping, and somebody came up to her and said, "Just stop crying, stop crying." And I was just a little kid. I even knew then. I was like, you tell somebody to stop crying? You're sitting there, your heart's being ripped out. I don't know what this lady was thinking. Now, Jesus had a reason to tell her. My friend was just like, basically, suck it up and man up or whatever, which is rude. Hold that off till later. Jesus had a reason, but that's still an uncomfortable, you're putting yourself in an uncomfortable position. But that's nothing. Look at the next thing he did. So verse 14, and he came up and he touched the coffin. Do you understand just how much effort it took with societal expectations and even possibly some expectations of the law here to come up and actually touch the coffin? This is an intrusion. And I hope you're seeing that compassion almost always requires an uncomfortable intrusion. It just does. Not just for the people, but it would be hard for me to do this, to walk up to stop crying, put my hand on the coffin, whatever. That's a tough thing. It's an intrusion. But of course, and then he said, "Young man, I say to you, arise." Now, I wonder at what point, what the time lapse between arise and when he actually came up. We'll see in just a second. I wonder if there's a time lapse between young man arise and when he actually rose. If there was an awkward 10 seconds of silence, people were all horrified, I'm sure. If he immediately came up, they're like, "Oh, yeah. But like, I can't believe he's telling this dead guy to come up. Everybody's all upset and everything. My point is, compassion is not always comfortable. You hear what I'm saying? Now, Jesus knew that he's going to get through this discomfort really quickly because the boy was going to be raised from the dead. But so we have Jesus showing compassion for the blind, showing compassion for those who are hurting. Someone that, and then Mark 8:2. Look at verse 1. You know the story. In those days, when there was again a large crowd and they had nothing to eat, Jesus called his disciples and said to them, I feel compassion for the people. Now again, Jesus came to seek and save the lost, and we'll get to a verse that talks about compassion with that in just a second. But here, the compassion wasn't specifically directed to their need for truth. He says, I feel compassion for the people because they have remained with me now for 3 days and have nothing to eat. And the next verse tells us he was really interested in not sending them away hungry. His compassion was focused on their physical needs. So here we have 3 examples. Somebody who was blind, someone who was suffering, people who were hungry. This is the example of when Jesus, he not only was moved to compassion, but he chose to stop and do something about it. He didn't just go up to the blind people and say, yeah, you're blind, but you know what? I'm going to preach to you instead. Now, did Jesus preached to everybody. But I want you to understand, he did not think that it was insignificant that they were blind. He did not think, and again, you might say, well, John says that he did this so they would believe. Well, that's true. But the Bible clearly says that, oh, by the way, can there be more than one reason to do a thing? Yeah. One of the reasons was they would believe. The other reason was he felt compassion. He was moved by that. He was moved. He didn't just go and say, forget that stuff. I want to tell you the stuff that's more important. Forget that you're hungry. I mean, you need the bread of life. Man should not live by bread alone. Okay, but I'm hungry. He saw that, and it mattered to him. But of course, you can't forget compassion goes from birth to glory. It goes from the physical to the spiritual. It's not just compartmentalized. And I'm glad that the Bible uses these. Last one I want to show you is Matthew 9. Matthew 9, and we'll start in verse 35. Jesus was going through all the cities and villages, teaching in their synagogues and proclaiming the gospel of the kingdom and and healing every kind of disease and every kind of sickness. Seeing the people, here's the word, he felt compassion for them. Now this time, it didn't say because they were sick, because they were hungry. Other times it was. But listen to what he says here. He felt compassion for them because they were distressed and dispirited like sheep without a shepherd. Now, was it simply that he was upset because they were sad, maybe discouraged and depressed? You could read into that, except for the next verse. 2 verses. Then he said to the disciples, the harvest is plentiful, but the workers are few. Therefore beseech the Lord of the harvest to send out workers into his harvest. The Lord felt compassion because not only were they as if they had no shepherd, they had no shepherd, and they had no fold, and they were lost. And so compassion goes all the way. Now, I just want to challenge you because I have to go on. We will never finish this, but I have to move on a little bit. One of the ways, I often hear people, okay, I guess I can talk about myself more than people. Sometimes I turn my compassion knob down a little bit. My compassion sensitivity knob down just a little bit when I've got stuff to do. There have been times when I have passed by someone that I thought they don't look like it's an emergency, they probably could use my help, but I got an appointment to get to. Somebody else will send that to them. Because you know what it would have been difficult to do? It would have been difficult, I'm talking about somebody like on the side of the road or something. Because sometimes it's a little more difficult to call and say, I'm going to be 20 or 30 minutes late for this appointment, which almost everybody, if you tell them the circumstances, 99% of the people would be like, okay with that. They'd be doing that. It's more difficult to do that than to actually say to yourself, well, you know what? There's people coming down this road all the time. There's probably somebody that has more time. And I'm not going to get you to raise your hand, but you ever had that reasoning? Because you've got so many things that you've got to do, and it doesn't look like it's an emergency anyway. We'll let somebody take care of that. But compassion causes you to do uncomfortable and inconvenient things at times. But interestingly enough, what if you, me, or whoever did do the uncomfortable thing of missing an appointment or being late for an appointment, sending a message that we're going to be late, maybe making my day a little bit longer and a little bit more hectic, I just wonder if the next person who stopped would have also had the knowledge of Jesus Christ with them. You got to think about these things. Now, I'm not saying that I'm going to stop at every, there's a million things to do in life. But the compassion button, it's really easy to turn it down is what my point is. What about this one? There's so many people asking for money, I don't know who I want to help because I want to make the most use of my money. And that's all fine. That's true, isn't it? There's a lot of people that are standing on the street. They're going to use it for alcohol or whatever. There's a lot of people that that may ask for help. That'll still use it for ridiculous stuff. I mean, it's not just people on the side of the road that are begging that'll take your money and do ridiculous things. Sometimes it's the person sitting right beside you that'll take the money and do ridiculous things. For you to be wise in that, besides praying, what else do you have to do? Have to investigate a little bit, ask some questions, spend some time. That's what compassion does. How convenient is that? It's not always convenient. And sometimes it does cost you. Sometimes when you do help, you're trying to decide, how is it going to take away from my time? How is this going to take away maybe from my resources? And what could I use this? My point is, it takes time. You pray, but you have to research. It takes time to do these things.
I find that one of the things that mutes my compassion is my sense of justice. Mm-hmm. I feel like if somebody does something, and even though they find themselves in the same situation needing compassion, I feel like I need to give them the same justice that they just exhibited. Somebody was unkind to somebody else, and then they fell on some hard times. They need kindness from me. I'm like, no, I don't think so. Yeah. So my sense of judgment, boy, that sounds harsh. Yeah. My sense of justice kind of inhibits that sometimes.
Yeah. And sometimes, and you've heard me say this many times before, so there's not only that, there's a sense of justice. Well, they're getting a taste of their own medicine. Anybody ever said that? They're getting a taste of their own medicine. It's interesting. It's easy to turn your compassion button down when somebody's getting a taste of their own medicine. But, and then you've heard me say this one before, a lot of times we're like, well, they're just going to have to reap the consequences of their bad choices, And so we say the common statement, they made their bed, they can what? They can lie in that thing. They made their bed, they can lie in it. But then we stop and think a couple of things. How many of you have ever been bailed out by somebody who has helped you with something that was your own fault? Man, I have been bailed out so many times by people who have been rescuing me or have helped me from something that was my fault. And then ultimately, and again, you've heard me say this before, as the world, as sinners before we came to Christ, who made our own bed? We did, and Jesus lied in it. He laid there. He's the one who slept there. So sometimes we have to really think about that and back up because, Jesus, he did show compassion to the blind people. Was it their fault they were blind? Was it his sin or his parents' sin? There's another, those questions that come up. It doesn't even matter. Was it the woman's fault that her son died? I guess it could have been, some weird situation, but probably not. You know what I'm saying? Probably not. He went and helped. And it's the same thing. They were, so the ones who were sheep without a shepherd, that was their fault. They chose those things. And Jesus had the same compassion on those who it was their fault and who it wasn't their fault. So again, the whole point I'm saying this, I'm not saying I got this down pat. I wish I could tell you, man, I want to tell you how I uncomfortably and perfectly showed compassion and kindness over this past week. But I will tell you this, it's important for us to think about it because it's so easy to turn that off and even define things. We could say, well, yeah, that needs to be done, but I've got more important work of the Lord. But it's interesting that Jesus understanding people a lot more than we do, would go into the midst of their own problems. Some of them they created themselves, and he would get all dirty and messy within that so that he would actually have the opportunity. And that's going to take us to keep this cannot just be goal and agenda oriented. I can't just say, well, I'm going to be nice to Jim over here because it might eventually affect his salvation. Because if it's mechanical like that and it's not real and I'm not really putting on compassion and developing, I will get tired of that real easy. You weren't the best example of that. You're a good guy. But you know what I'm saying. It's just like when you pretend to be something that you're not, it wears off. We need to just pray that the Lord helps us, and as we grow, to actually be compassionate people. Because maybe this is too bold to say, but I'm going to say this. For myself, I would not be completely convinced of my own compassion for someone else's eternal soul if I felt nothing for their present condition. Not sure. That might be a good sign for yourself. You might even go around and say, I can't deal with this, I got to deal with eternity. Really don't have compassion, you might think that that's a sign that maybe something else is going on with your compassion for their eternity as well. It's a good litmus test for kind of where you are at that point. Now, there's no way we're going to get any of this, but this was not my notes, but we're going to go there anyway. Hebrews 5. You know, this is not directly related to this, but I'm going to put it out there anyway. You know, the concern for the Hebrew writer is these guys should have been teachers by now, right? You know, we had to be taught again. By now you ought to be teachers. Come on, guys. It was going on saying, you know, you should be eating meat. You need milk again. But let's, in the context of all that, look at verse 13 of chapter 5. Chapter 5, verse 13. For everyone who partakes only of milk is not accustomed to the word of righteousness, for he is an infant. But solid food is for the mature, who because of practice have their senses trained to discern good and evil. And I love this. Sometimes you have to practice righteousness to be able to understand what's right and what's wrong, and to be able to actually have that in your desires and your will. You practice it, even if you're not quite there. Even if you're not quite there, you through faith, and again, I hate the idea you fake it till you make it. You use faith until you make it. But through faith, you move forward and do those things that you know the Lord would have you do, and you know the Lord's working on you. You know, one of the best ways to develop compassion and kindness is to practice it. And again, you're praying as well. You're trying to put, you know, the Lord has given you the heart of compassion. It's already there. He's given you His heart. He's given you His mind. He's given you these things, and they're developing. But we have to put them on. And so one of the things is to pray that the Lord helps us to see this. Pray that the Lord helps us to have compassion. Pray that the Lord helps us to really care about even, you know, Jesus always takes things to the extreme. And I know always is an extreme thing to say, but He seemed to do it. He seemed to take things to the extreme. That's when He said, you've heard it said, love your neighbor. We're like, yeah, love your neighbor. Yeah, we've heard that. It's been in the law forever, whatever, you know. And Jesus said, but I say to you, you know, that's a tough one anyway. And it's kind of old school and, you know, kind of been beat, that teaching's been beat to death, you know. And Jesus said, but I'm telling you, I say to you, love your enemy. You know, Jesus is taking things to the extreme, because these are things we need His help, and we need to practice those things. Practice those things as they come up. So the way that we do it, we through faith practice believing that we are who God actually says we are, believing that we do have that compassion. You know, we have it. I'm not feeling it right now, Lord, but I'm going to trust you that it's there. I'm going to tell you that the feeling will come. You know, and just one suggestion, you know, maybe the next time you hear somebody talk about how bad their life is, I'll give you, I don't think there's anybody this person would ever see this, but there's one person that's not even related to me, but was kind of dating somebody that was related to a step version of my family one time, and that she friended me on Facebook, so I took it. But it's always interesting to me that she is forever getting in horrible situations, and she's spending money she doesn't have. She's quitting a job because somebody made her mad, and then she doesn't have any money to buy food. She's going from this boy to that boy to this guy, and they're always breaking up. She's always talking about how she can't trust anybody. There's no love. And I keep watching that. I can't help but keep going, because I'm like, will somebody not sit her down and tell her that her life doesn't have to be so crazy? Doesn't she have a good friend that would just slap her around a little bit and just say, stop doing all this dumb stuff and maybe your life will be a little bit better? But, you know, probably 6 months ago, I just said, I have no influence over there's no contact. I have no real influence with this person. But I'm going to start praying for her, because sometimes you get caught in the nasty circle of bad choices, and it really is hard to break. Can I have a little bit of compassion? Maybe something like what you were saying, Sue, a little bit. Maybe can I have a little bit more compassion, and maybe say she is genuinely hurting, and just pray that somehow or another somebody that will be in her area of influence in that part of the country can help her a little bit, kind of get through the intense insanity of all this, and help her to see the better way, rather than just being like, yeah, I'm coming here to watch the drama today because I'm expecting it, because that's just what your life is going to be. Compassion is, I don't want anybody to be like that. If that girl were my daughter, sometimes I talk tough when it talks to my kids and stuff, but I want to tell you, if that was one of my daughters, I would tell the truth, but I would be doing everything I could to help her get out of that, so that her life could be better, even if she was making bad, horrible choices. So why would I not at least care for that person as well? So it's interesting. Jesus is working in all this, because, yeah, you've got mind, you've got body, you've got spirit, you've got when there's issues, there's mental issues, spiritual issues, physical issues, emotional issues. We can talk, but those are all interconnected. Those things are all interconnected to some degree. So a lot of the things that you see, Jesus, well, yeah, but that's affected everything that they do. And sometimes to get to the things that people need to hear, you got to not only get to the issue at hand, but you got to, and this is where I'm going with here, you got to care about the issue at hand. And here we're talking about brethren. We're talking about Christians to other Christians here. Because sometimes it is more, I got to end. Sometimes we can be more judgmental about those who know the truth than those who don't. But still, that part of compassion needs to be there. I'm not going to have time to finish it. There's a lot of, why don't you read Colossians 3 there? There's a lot of good stuff there, but the point is, and the summary of this is, the Lord has made you new. He has made you a new creation. He has given you a new heart. But there is prayer, and there's effort, and there's practice to actually put that on. And Jesus is the best example to show us how to do that. So I'm just going to end with that, and maybe if I get a chance to come back to it sometime, the rest of this chapter, I will.